Joining me now on the 1085 Gridiron podcast. He is a friend of the show. He's been a guest before on the show. He is a writer for the Browns Wire, and he is the host of the Hurry Up podcast. It's my buddy Mac Robinson. Mac, what's going on, man?
How you doing, Jack?
Oh, I'm doing well, man. Just want to thank you. I know you're busy this week. For those that don't know, Mac is down covering the Senior Bowl for the Browns Wire along with Jeff Risdon, and they're doing a great job this week. And Mac, just to kick off the interview, what's it like being able to go down to Mobile this week to take part in the Senior Bowl?
It's been a little bit of a whirlwind for me personally. Previously, one of the few events I've been able to cover too was the Combine a couple years ago, but really down here in Mobile, it's a little bit of a different animal because at least when it came to Indy, it was a lot more people talking, everything like that. You get close to free agency, you know what everybody's doing, but down here at the Senior Bowl, it's kind of a little bit of sharing notes in a way, where people are kind of seeing how do you feel about this prospect and kind of seeing how the entire environment kind of grows more and more. But even more so than that, I think it's a little bit more of an experience because the Combine, obviously, you get down to the nitty-gritty. People are going to be here for testing, everything like that. But here, it gives you a little bit more of a look into the players as people because it's a little bit more closer to the action. You get a little bit more access, not crazy access or anything like that. That's more so the Shrine Game and the NFLPA Bowl that they do as well. But here at the Senior Bowl, getting a chance to. I didn't get a chance to talk to him, but I know another friend here, Pete Smith, got a chance to chat with Jalen Ferguson yesterday, defensive end. From Louisiana Tech, one of the most prolific pass rushers in college football. But he got a chance to chat with him a little bit. I got a chance to chat with Andy Isabella, Northeast Ohio native, along with another Northeast Ohio native, John Cominsky, as well, during the media day sessions. But on top of that, too, the media contingencies down here, it's great to see everybody. And really, it's a fun time all around, especially if you're covering it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's an event where, you know, a lot of people are going to watch the game on Saturday, but practices are like what the teams are really watching. And from my understanding, the teams are out of there by the time Saturday rolls around and it's game time. They really focus in on these practices. And based on what you got to see yesterday, I know today, we're recording on Wednesday, practice was moved indoors because of weather, but, you know, what was the atmosphere like during that practice session? Have you ever seen anything like it? I mean, compared to like an NFL training camp, for instance?
It's kind of, I'll put it like this. It's NFL training camp on steroids because you have obviously certain people that you want to watch. So in training camp, I can go ahead and watch the defensive line group if I want to. I can watch the linebackers if I want to. But in this way, they had it kind of blown up to the sense that you literally had media contingencies of midfield on the one sideline. Myself, Jeff Risdon, as well as some of the guys from the Draft Network, and the Detroit Lions podcast as well. We were all kind of grouped together in the back of the end zone, and the one disadvantage to that was the fact that when it came to certain teams, they kind of flipped the fields between the South squad and the North squad. So full disclosure before we dive into it, on the South side, I was able to check out the offensive line and the defensive line kind of going at it. But when it came to the North side, they ended up having more offensive players going on that side. So I got to see more wide receivers, some of the quarterback play from the North squad, and a little bit less of the defensive line from that team.
You were talking about the offensive and defensive line going at it. One video that I seen that kind of went viral this last night and this morning on Twitter was Montez Sweat just obliterating that offensive lineman. Were you fortunate enough to see that close up?
Oh yeah. That was I was probably about like 10 rows deep in the stands. Like that was right in front of me. So that was, you literally could audibly hear people going, "Oh my God," because the way that he just not only he stiff armed him, with one hand, for those of you who haven't seen the video, stiff arms him with one hand, and then he's able to kind of go ahead and use his other hand to rip and use a swim move as well. So it gives him a lot more ability to move through and kind of plan out his next move. And that was the thing, was that wasn't just one play. That's what people saw. But Montez Sweat was doing that all practice long. And that's the one advantage that I would say, too, is being here live, because I've watched it before at home and everything like that. But at the same time, being here live, you're able to focus on some of the things that, sure, the TV might not necessarily think that it's entertaining. But getting a chance to see these guys go rep in, rep out, that's huge.
Yeah, and let's already just dive right into Montez Sweat. I mean, he is one of the top defensive players in this draft. I've seen him ranked in like the 10 to 20 range, but I've already seen some reports today saying, because he went to the Senior Bowl and because he's been balling out, he might go top 10 at this point. Based on what you've seen prior to the Senior Bowl, what was your thoughts on Montez Sweat?
When it came to Montez Sweat, the one thought that I had before is that he comes from a talented group, and obviously that's not his fault. But the thing is that it's one of those questions where you have, okay, this guy is obviously dominant. Like I mentioned, the fact that you see that constant stiff arm from him that kind of adds a lot of versatility for him going forward. But for him, is it one of those things where he doesn't necessarily have to worry about a double team, or he might not necessarily have to worry about some of the other factors that you might have with, say, a John Cominsky, where he's the guy at his point. So for him, John Cominsky's the guy at D2, and so the offensive line will be focusing on him heavily. Whereas Montez Sweat, there's a ton of talent all along the defensive line. They obviously also have Jeffrey Simmons, the defensive tackle, there as well. And for him, it's kind of one of those things where, for Montez, obviously great player, very talented player. I think he's going to go first round, obviously. But same time, I think that top 10, I don't know if I would feel comfortable going that high with him. But I do think that he's a very talented player, and he definitely has a place in the league.
Another guy that really shined during day one of Senior Bowl practice was Andy Isabella, the wide receiver out of UMass. Now, there was a buzz on Brown's Twitter about him prior to the Senior Bowl, but he killed his interview yesterday when he said that he was working with Randy Moss, and he's claiming that he runs a 4.26, and then to go out on the field, and he had a pretty strong day from what I've seen. What was your impressions of him?
For one, I would say when it came to the interview process, I mean, I loved it. I was right there with him. So I was there, standing there with the interview process and everything like that for Andy. But the one thing was that there was a little bit of a buzz for him, especially during the weigh-in, because coming in, he was listed at 5'10", 195. But when he came in, he was measured at 5'8" and 7/8. And then weight-wise, he was at 186. So he came in a bit smaller. And, I mean, it was noticeable next to the competition, but at the same time, the quickness that the guy showed on the field, really, he can improve the route running a little bit, because from some of the guys that I was talking to there at the Senior Bowl as well, he seems to kind of use his feet a little bit too much. He gets a little bit foot happy with it. So that's something that he can try to improve. But at the same time, I mean, when you're working with Randy Moss, like, yeah, you're going to be able to kind of improve some of those things as well. But I loved what I saw out of Andy Isabella. And I will say, in the interview process, dude was very poised. And it was I don't want to say cocky, because all of a sudden everybody, that's red flag right away. But almost a cool confidence. And I will say, too, the chip on that guy's shoulder is tremendous, because he was somebody who, I mean, he mentioned it yesterday, but every place that he's gone, they've said that he's too small, and he ends up coming through, and he ends up being productive at every level. So for him, he's somebody I'm really interested in, and I'm going to be honest, I'm hopeful that he goes to the Browns, because I am a big Andy Isabella fan.
Based on people you've talked to down there, where are they expecting him to be drafted?
It's tough to see where he goes, because, like I mentioned, the size factor of it, and even the footwork, being a little bit too foot happy with it. Some people have said that he should go a little bit later on, maybe in the third or so. But with the way that he's been kind of boosting his stock, there's a good possibility he could go higher than that. So it's going to be interesting to see where he falls. But I think that somewhere on day 2, you could see with a possibility that he goes day 3. But I think that he's one of those guys who you're going to want on your team for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even looking at the numbers alone, 1,700 yards, 102 receptions. He had a killer game against Georgia, which I think that'll turn scouts' heads immediately, especially coming out of UMass to have a big game like that against Georgia. But, he continues to ball out. I could definitely see him as a day 2 pick, like you suggested.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, the kind of cool confidence that he had, I really liked what I saw, and based on what I saw from some people who were in attendance today, it really seemed like he was having another productive day here for day 2.
Anybody else that really caught your eye during day 1 of Senior Bowl practice?
Yes. So there was Terry McLaurin, the wide receiver from Ohio State. He was having a really good day. Really, when it came to his route running, it was just plant and go. And so he was doing a really good job. Also, another wide receiver, Jacoby Myers from North Carolina State, had a really good day. And then that's all on the North squad. On the South squad, I would say Anthony Johnson a little bit from some of the people who were a little bit closer to the wide receivers over there. He seemed like he was having a really good day over there. Also, too, Deebo Samuel. Obviously, he's been a name that's been hotly mentioned, but he officially weighed in yesterday at he came in height-wise at, let me see if I can find it, just to make sure I give you the correct measurements here. Let me see here. He came in at 5'11" and a half. But he weighed in at 216 pounds, so take that for what you will. That's a good sign for Cleveland. But also, I will say, when it comes to interior defensive line, I know he might not necessarily be one of those guys where he fits as a 3-tech, but somebody I definitely want on my team is Dalen Mack, based on what I saw out of Texas A&M. So he's 6'1", and he came in around 320 pounds. But at the same time, dude has a low center of gravity, and he was really using it well yesterday. Really impressing, officially weighing in at 327 pounds. He also has big hands at 10 inches and 1/8. So he was really balling out. Also, one more name real quick. Terrell Hanks ended up coming in, and he's a linebacker out of New Mexico State, and the dude looked chiseled. I know my editor for Browns Wire, Jeff Risden, called him the human action figure because he looked like he was one of those G.I. Joe characters that you ended up getting as a kid.
You mentioned a lot of wide receivers. Mac, I know a lot of people, especially on Twitter, we see it constantly. The Browns fans think like wide receivers like the top need going into the offseason. There's a lot of fans that want us to go out and trade for Antonio Brown or Odell Beckham. How much of a need do you think the wide receiver position is as it stands now for the Cleveland Browns?
I mean, I think it's one of those ones that can be upgraded. Sure, you have some players that, I mean, would I like Odell Beckham on this team? Absolutely. Would I love Antonio Brown on this team? Absolutely. But I also think, too, that when you have a quarterback like Baker Mayfield, you don't necessarily need to go all out like that. That might be one of those pieces where it's like it's a cherry on top where we need to go for this. But I wouldn't necessarily put it at that high of a need. A more pressing need is, I would say, a pass rushing defensive tackle, as well as pass rushing depth along the defensive line. I would put those ahead. I would put linebacker for sure ahead of that need as well. Possibly an offensive tackle, because and I will say this in speaking to some people down here with more knowledge than I, what they were basically saying is that when it comes to Greg Robinson, I mean, would they like to have him back? Sure, but at the same time, they also are realistic with the fact that he has not played like this in the past. So for them, it's one of those things where we're not going to go completely crazy and signing to a completely crazy number. But I think that there is a chance that Greg Robinson ends up moving on this offseason.
Yeah, we had an interesting debate this morning on Twitter. I don't know if you've seen it, between myself and Anthony and other people, where Anthony floated out the idea that the Browns franchise tag Greg Robinson, and I immediately stepped in. I was like, Anthony is like, I love Greg Robinson, and he played well in the second half, but you do not commit $14 million to that guy. And he said he gave his good reasoning for it, and I thought he had a good take. Obviously, he's not here to defend himself, but with Greg Robinson, you don't want to commit too much money to him. You'd like to have him back, but if you can't, then you move on in another direction. We obviously still have Desmond Harrison, and add in the fact that we just added one of the best offensive line coaches to the staff in James Campen, so maybe he can work on Desmond Harrison. But like you said, and like the people down there are saying, you don't need to necessarily break the bank for Robinson.
Yeah, and the other thing too that I would say about Harrison too is the fact that he was very skinny. And so for him, it's going to be a very uphill battle for him going forward. Obviously, he has the pedigree in the past, but at the same time, he's going to need to kind of build up strength in the offseason, and it's going to have to be legitimate strength when it comes down to it, instead of just some of those kind of give the guy a bunch of eggs, give the guy a bunch of other kind of adding on a little bit more weight. It has to be muscle. So for him, that's going to be kind of the main focus this offseason. But I mean, a couple of the guys that I was looking at down here, keeping an eye on, the one that I've heard a little bit of buzz with is Andre Dillard, a little bit with Washington State. He's 6'5", about 308 pounds here, officially weighed in. And so for him, he's somebody that I would keep my eye on, depending on the way free agency goes. Now, I've talked about this with some people, but the way that the Senior Bowl is different from the Combine is that timeline-wise, you end up getting a lot more clarity when it comes to where teams are going to go, where players are leaning, a little bit closer to the Combine, seeing as that is the week right before the free agency kicks off. So here, it's a lot more up in the air. And so for the Browns, it could be one of those situations where they might address with a pass rusher, as well as a few other big needs that they fill through for agency. So that offers up maybe an Andre Dillard in the draft, or depending on how that goes, it can kind of swing a different way. So it's kind of up in the air when it comes to that.
Is there any other players that you're hearing connected to the Browns that are down there at the Senior Bowl right now, besides the ones you've mentioned so far?
I mean, not really, honestly. Those were the big names that kind of stood out, at least stood out to me and everything like that. The other one, too, that I've been keeping my eye on, too, is Kalen Sanders, the defensive tackle. He was listed coming into this at 6'2", 310 pounds, but when it came to him actually getting measured for the North Squad, he ended up coming in at 6 foot, 320. So for him, it's kind of adding on a little bit more weight, which you need to, especially on the interior defensive line. But coming in a little bit shorter, maybe trying to see if you can use that leverage a little bit better, seeing as you're a little bit lower to the ground. So he's somebody that I'm keeping my eye on as well. Another guy, too, one guy that I want to make sure that I talk about, too, is Donald Parham. He's the tight end out of Stetson. He was 6'8", and my God, the guy, so they had him listed coming in at 222. Guy weighed in at 243 with 10 and a half inch hands and a 36 inch arms. The dude looked like a monster. And so, and the craziest part is that running down the field, the guy looks smooth too. So he was somebody that I was a big fan of yesterday for sure. A couple other guys too, like I mentioned, Jalen Ferguson I like as well. And then also to Jonathan Ledbetter, the defensive lineman from Georgia, I liked a little bit down there as well. And one real quick one as well, interior defensive lineman Drew Samia from Oklahoma has a fantastic career as a bouncer at a bar if he needs it, because the guy, first of all, great tattoos, and second of all, was absolutely jacked, and he had a really good mean streak to him a little bit, finishing plays, going after players, making sure that he's very aggressive on the field. So he looked pretty good out there as well.
One guy that I told you when we set this up like a couple weeks ago to keep an eye on was John Cominsky, and his name is generating a ton of buzz, which I was fully expecting based on what I had known coming into the Senior Bowl. For those that don't know who Cominsky is, he is a Northeast Ohio native, was a quarterback at Barberton, and ended up becoming a monster of a man, 6'5", 286, defensive lineman at the University of Charleston. Mac, I know you got to spend some time with him yesterday. First of all, what's your thoughts on him, and have you got to see some of his tape from Charleston?
I will say I have not gotten a chance to see his tape because it's hard to come by. I would say that it's hard to find a Charleston tape. But the one thing that I will say is that getting a chance to talk to him, very down to earth guy and very well spoken to. I came up to him right at the beginning of his media session as well, and I was stuck there for about 20 minutes. I don't want to say stuck there because honestly, it was really enjoyable just being there, talking with him and everything like that. He was very loose with it, not really feeling kind of trapped like I know some players did at the same time. But I will say for him, obviously, like you mentioned, an interesting kind of road for him to get here, and he was one of those guys who, I mean, you mentioned it a little bit, but he played quarterback. He mentioned he played free safety on defense as well. He said day one that he stepped on Charleston, he was 6'4", 215, and when he weighed in here, he was at 6'5", 285. So for him, it's all about building it up, and he talked a little bit about the fact that when he was at Charleston, he was bullying people by his speed and his size. And what he said he's been trying to improve on is working on his technique and not necessarily trying to win based on just physical traits, because you can't do that at the next level. But for him, it's about constantly improving in that. And I'll also say, too, the way that Cominsky was carrying himself and really was very candid about the fact that he said, I think that we got more media attention at Barberton than we did at Charleston. So for him, he's just enjoying this. And finally, last but not least, too, the way that and I said this about Andy Isabella, but he wasn't cocky, but he had a very large chip on his shoulder, because the way that he said it to me was the fact that, look, I know that I'm a D2 prospect, and I know that people are expecting me to just kind of be part of the group or try to be part of the group. But he said, I'm looking to prove that I'm the best of the best here, and not necessarily just looking at the fact that I'm just trying to compete. I'm trying to prove that I am the best of the best. You need to watch and know who I am. So for me, I loved that coming out of him, and I loved the kind of confidence that he had.
Yeah, I mean, coming out of a D2 school, there's a lot of people that are probably just looking at him and saying he was invited because, he's a monster of a man, but the guy can definitely play. And I can share this little tidbit. I was told about a month ago that if he balls out here at the Senior Bowl, he's going to go to the Combine, and I'm expecting him to do that just because I think he's a hard worker based on people I've talked to. And I would not be shocked when it's all said and done if he's a day 2 pick, because I think the defensive line depth in this draft is deep, and I think he can stand out. And yeah, I know the Browns are looking for defensive linemen. I think that's apparent. I think we all are expecting them to add some. If Cominsky was a day 2 pick, and I told Stephen Thomas this too, and he goes, man, I hope he makes it to day 3. I don't think he's going to. I think he's really going to impress. Based on the little tape that I got to see out of Charleston, the guy can definitely play.
Yeah, and that's the one thing that I would say, too, is kind of the general vibe that I got from him, too, is the fact that he understands where he's at, but at the same time, he's trying to get better each and every day. And for him, like I mentioned, the fact that he's trying to work on technique, trying to get better each and every day. And he's one of those guys where he's a selfless player. So for him, he can go ahead and contribute day one on special teams and help you out in that regard. And as he kind of builds up more and more, I think early on you can see him be one of those rotational defensive linemen that the Browns do sorely need. So honestly, if he became a Cleveland Brown, I also would be very happy about that.
Yeah, looking at your article, did he say anything about, the possibility of playing for the Browns? Did anybody ask him about it?
Yeah. He talked about the fact that he thought that probably the best memory for the Browns even that he even has is this past year, because of the fact that, look, this team is hopeful going forward, and this team you can be proud of going forward, basically. And he said that, well, because of the way that the Browns have played over the last 20 years, he wasn't necessarily the biggest Browns fan because of that, but he said that his dad's a big-time Browns fan and a Browns diehard, so I'm sure that for him it would be one of those great abilities to play for his dad's favorite team. So
yeah, I mean that would be awesome to see, guys like Isabella or Cominsky having that opportunity to play for their home area team. And if we've seen it already with Denzel Ward, if these guys can come home and help turn the Browns around into a contender, it would make for an awesome story.
Yeah, for sure. And the one thing that I will say, and I do want to touch on here, is the fact that we're not talking about players just because they're from Cleveland, but we're talking about them because they're extremely talented players from Cleveland. And that's the thing that I love, is the fact that there are these guys who, look, they go ahead and they have this kind of confidence with them. But I will say the one thing that I saw between those two is the fact that overall you saw the way that they would be able to fit with this Cleveland Browns team, and that, like I mentioned, the kind of chip on their shoulder where they go ahead and they say, all right, look, I might not have been able to make it, or they might have had their doubts coming into this, but I'm going to make sure that I prove them wrong, and that I show them that I can perform at this next level. I can go past this. For Andy Isabella, he talked about the fact that, sure, people are going to go ahead and assume, and let's be honest, the guy's a 5'8" white receiver. People are going to assume Danny Amendola or Julian Edelman. But no, honestly, like in talking to some of the writers down here, I know one for sure, my editor Jeff Risden has been on the record saying that he would say more so Deshaun Jackson with him, because of the speed that the guy possesses and the way that he's able to play. He can play inside, he can play out, and he's one of those guys where, like I said, just improve the footwork a little bit, but I think that he's one of those guys who can take that next step and can take that leap.
You probably didn't expect me to talk about this, but, there was some talk about quarterbacks this morning on Twitter, shockingly. The Browns fans were talking about quarterbacks still, despite the fact that we have one with Baker. And they were talking about potentially adding one in the middle to late rounds. Did you get a chance to watch the quarterbacks? And if you did, who impressed you on the first day?
Oh, God. I'll put it this way. Browns fans, you should be happy that we took a quarterback when we did, because this quarterback class is not great. It's not great. Drew Lock had some good throws down the field. He looked like he was kind of having a little bit of swagger with him, but when it came to some of the other quarterbacks, Trace McSorley stuck out in a bad way. He did not have a good day. I'll just put it that way to keep it short with that. But I mean, Ryan Lindley looks all right. I mean, nothing crazy. The only one that I could see possibly being in the division is Tyree Jackson, where out of Buffalo, where the guy came in at a legitimate 6'7", just under 250 pounds. And the guy looks big, but the thing is, he's 6'7", but he looks skinny. Like, and that's what's crazy is he weighs in at 250 pounds or so, and he looks skinny. So he's somebody who's intriguing. But honestly, like I don't necessarily know if I would take a shot on one of these guys. I mean, out of anybody, the one that I've seen people kind of mention is Gardner Minshew a little bit, possibly partnering him up with Baker a little bit. But I mean, other than that, I don't necessarily know if there's a quarterback that I would necessarily want on this team.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I'm not even looking at the quarterbacks, to be honest. And I think me and Anthony already said when we talk about some of the draft prospects, we're not even going to discuss quarterbacks. I think the best news when it came to Browns quarterbacks today was when Albert Breer told Bull and Fox that John Dorsey told him that he was sold on Baker Mayfield as the top pick in October, 2 months before he even took the Browns general manager position. So I think that is satisfying that when Dorsey took the job, he knew already what quarterback he was going to take.
Yeah, and that was the thing was, I mean, I know I've mentioned it on multiple occasions, but I mean, for me, Baker was my top guy. I loved the way that he was able to play and everything like that, and obviously Dorsey agreed, but for this team, I think that Baker Mayfield all around, and I know I've had a few tweets about it here in the last week or so, but Baker just all around he just exudes what you want out of the Cleveland Browns. And I can tell you that even on the schedule of events that they gave us on the first day for the Senior Bowl, Baker Mayfield is right on the front cover. So I know I've said it to Jeff Risen a little bit, but every time I see Baker's face kind of plastered around here as one of their successes, I do get quite a grin.
And as we all should, because he was fantastic his rookie year. I did mention John Dorsey. Mac, from what you've seen, how large is the Browns contingent down there in Mobile, of course, which is led by Dorsey?
Pretty big, actually. I found it interesting, and I didn't get a chance to tweet it out, but John Dorsey was, when the Browns had their own kind of row with the personnel department. I haven't seen Freddie here yet, but I know that he's here. And talking to some other people as well. But I didn't get a chance to see any of that or anything like that. But the one thing that I will say is that when it came to the personnel department that was sitting up there, Dorsey was sitting in the – basically to give you guys kind of a visual here, they had a entire kind of an auditorium type setup for us where they had grandstands in the back, but there was a general area in the front, right up front in front of the stage, where you had all of the personnel kind of sitting up front. You could sit wherever you wanted, really. And so you ended up seeing the Browns guys line up in a row closest to the middle. So Dorsey was in the middle, and right next to him was Andrew Berry, which I found interesting as one of the guys left over from the last regime as well. But there was a pretty good group of Browns people that I see a good amount of them across the city pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, I would expect this is John Dorsey's, this is his Super Bowl, I would say. Like the Senior Bowl, the Combine, he's still a scout at heart, regardless that he's the general manager. From my understanding is the dude is a scout, and I think he will be to the day he dies. Obviously, he set up a one-man scouting department in his house when he was between the Chiefs job and the Browns job. I think Albert Breer mentioned that today on his interview with Bull and Fox, but obviously him, I'm sure Elliott Wolf's down there, Highsmith, you mentioned Barry, and I do find it interesting that he was right next to Dorsey, like you suggested, so... and I know Kitchens is down there. I've seen he was chatting with Dabo Sweeney, I think yesterday. So it's really interesting to see what the Browns are up to, despite having the 17th pick in the draft, which is crazy to think after 0-16 a year ago.
Yeah, and one quick thing that I will mention as well, in talking to Pete Smith was on the same flight as Dorsey and all of the Browns contingency, basically. The odd man out was Alonzo Highsmith, who ended up being in, I economy with Pete. But the funny thing was that Freddie was flying in first class, and obviously the rest of them came dressed up, everything like that. John Dorsey, I will say, was in his traditional Browns sweatshirt with the same one. I'm pretty sure that he has about 7 of them, each with a different label for each day. But the one thing that I will say is that Freddie Kitchens, and I know Browns fans will love this, flew down to Mobile in first class wearing a flannel. So Freddie Kitchens staying on brand, wore a hat for his press conference, but wearing a flannel flying first class down to Mobile.
I'm disappointed he wasn't wearing the orange dog pound hoodie.
I mean, hey, man, I will say it was pretty chilly coming down here, so I don't blame him for the flannel. I will not blame him for that.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, Dorsey did meet with some of the media members down there, and he did acknowledge that they're in conversations with Greg Robinson, like we already talked about, as well as Breshad Perriman, Rashard Higgins, who's a restricted free agent. I would imagine he's probably discussing possible extensions with Schobert and Demarius Randall, who are coming up on their final years. Mac, when you look at how they're going to attack free agency, and there's also another interesting quote that Dorsey made about free agency, do you think, who would you expect would be the odd man out? I already know you mentioned Greg Robinson, but out of those 5 guys, or take Robinson out of the equation, Perriman, Higgins, Schobert, Randall, who do you think would be the odd man out in terms of getting a new contract?
Oh, man. I mean, it's tough. Honestly, if Higgins keeps this up, I would say Higgins. But honestly, I think that I can definitely see all of those guys re-upping, because the way that salary cap is working out this year, obviously the Browns have a ton that they can use in cap. But at the same time, I think it's going to be interesting because you see this kind of balance for them where they have players on young deals, obviously, but at the same time, you also want to keep that kind of to a little bit of a minimum here, as once Baker's deal kind of goes up and you're gonna have to pay all at once. You're going to have to pay all, and you saw it a little bit in Seattle when the Legion of Boom kind of ended up their clock kind of ran out for them. But you ended up seeing guys, you're going to end up seeing guys like Myles Garrett, Jabril Peppers, and David Njoku all come up in 1 year. You're going to end up seeing guys like Baker, Denzel Ward, Jannard Avery, Nick Chubb all come up in 1 year. So a lot of these guys, you got to keep in mind too. I definitely can see Breshad Perriman sticking around. I think that he's going to end up sticking around personally. But I also think they're going to be able to get it done with Randall. And then Schobert, I'm a huge fan of Joe Schobert. So if they can lock him up, I will be very happy.
Yeah, definitely. I hope they keep them all. I mean, I know Robinson and Perriman aren't long-term, but if you can keep them around short-term, I think that's a good thing. Dorsey told Zach Jackson of The Athletic, he said, "We are going to try to make the most prudent moves for the organization and try to put us into the best position moving forward. You have to be prudent in the free agent market. You don't want to go blow the bank there because you have to think 3 years down the road." And I think that's a good quote by Dorsey, because the one perception when he took the Browns job was that he was going to blow all this cap space that Sashi Brown created. And, everybody thought the first year, last year, when they signed Landry to an extension and they gave out some big contracts in free agency, that they thought Dorsey was just going to eat up all the cap space that was there. Not really. He was smart. He guaranteed some of these contracts where after a year or two he can get out of them, like Landry, Chris Hubbard, TJ Carey. He already dumped off Carlos Hyde in a trade. I don't think he's going to blow this. I think he knows that the Browns, and he wants to, and he keeps saying it, awake the sleeping giant. He's going to do this the right way, and he's also going to take advantage, though, of the fact that he has a lot of cap space and he has a franchise quarterback on a very friendly contract.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well, because, look, Browns fans, whether we like it or not, you got to realize that when you have Baker Mayfield playing on a level as he is right now, you have to strike while the iron is hot. And at the same time, I don't want them to completely blow their load when it comes to cap space, but I think that for them, it's going to be about certain players and picking your spots. Because like you mentioned, he was smart with the cap space last year. And I know a lot of people want to talk about, like the overall deal, because people were talking about, Chris Hubbard got $35 million or something along those lines. I don't have the numbers in front of me. But Chris Hubbard got an insane amount. No, he got a few guaranteed after the first year, but after that you can get out. In the same way, like you mentioned, TJ Carey. Guy had his spots. I wouldn't keep him around because he goes from around $3 million in cap space from year one up to around $8 million. So no, I wouldn't keep him around. But it's being smart with some of these players, giving them basically a trial run before. It's essentially like when you get your free trial for Netflix or something. If you like it, you keep it. If you don't, you can get out.
Exactly, and it's like the ongoing Jarvis Landry debate. We all know Jarvis Landry's not a number one wide receiver. He got paid like that because of the franchise tag. But if you look at it, the Browns can get out of it after next season. Yeah, that's $34.5 million wasted, but they don't have to pay him the full $75 million. They can get out of it next offseason and still have a ton of cap space to go out and get other guys. It's thankfully there's guys on Twitter that are cap gurus, and I use air quotes when I say that, but they kind of calm people down so that guys like Pete Smith don't have to beat the drum constantly about Jarvis Landry not being a number one wide receiver. I think we all can say Landry's good, but he's not that good.
Yeah, no. If Landry is your number one wide receiver, you are in a bad spot. And that's where the Browns were this year, honestly. So for them, this is kind of all about making sure that you're getting talented players in your groups and everything like that. And honestly, with the way that Baker Mayfield plays, I think that's why you saw the offense kind of pick up in the second half of the year. First half of the year, you were playing with Jarvis Landry being force-fed as he took on the role of being the number one wide receiver. And down the stretch, you saw that kind of shift away as they kind of spread the wealth a little bit more. And while that didn't work in Landry's favor, it might have worked better in his favor in yardage compared to what he had the year before. But in the same respect, it ended up benefiting the rest of the offense because you ended up seeing talented guys like a Rashard Higgins, like David Njoku getting the ball a lot more down the stretch. And you ended up seeing the wealth spread a little bit more. So, yeah, it does leave the versatility open to pick up some of these players that might get dumped off by another team, and you can go ahead and add them into the fold.
Definitely. Mac, it's a pleasure as always to talk to you, my man. Go ahead and plug everything that you're doing over on your side of things.
All right. So I'm down here at the Senior Bowl like Jack mentioned, but I have my podcast going up, the Hurry Up, the Browns Wire podcast. I had an episode drop this morning where I had some of the audio from the interviews with John Cominsky as well as Andy Isabella. Also, I had an article up for that Cominsky post as well. I'm gonna have an episode coming in the next day or so, depending on when we can get time. But I will be having an episode going up with Jeff Risdon, and we'll be talking a little bit about what we saw here this week, what we've seen, and what our thoughts are on the week as well. And then. Also, too, I actually just got picked up over at BigPlay.com, so I'm going to be a new writer for them as well, also covering the Browns as well as Cleveland sports in general, so I'm excited about that. And, so as always, you guys can follow me on Twitter at MacRobinsonCLE, so you guys can kind of follow along. I'll have all my updates on there as well, and that's the best place you guys can reach me.
Mac, pleasure as always, man. Thanks again for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Jack. Always love hopping on the show, man.
Yep. Take it easy, man.
You too.